Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. My apologies for any background noise. The weather is such that I do have the air conditioner in the window, so if you hear any fan noises or anything along that lines, that's what it is, because it is burning up in here, and I am sorry I'm not willing to go to the length of audio quality, and I'm not going to give myself a heat stroke for that, but with that being said, I know you guys are still like wearing your winter jackets up there and stuff. Being Canada and everything. Like I'm
Oh,
that far from you, but that's aside the point. But
it's not that different.
yeah, I'm pretty sure.
The snow's melting here.
No, it melted here like 2 weeks ago. Come on, but that being said, if you want to try to track us down, I'm pretty sure we do live in the same climate. So
Yeah, we do.
there's clue number one. More clues will be dropped throughout the show and the subsequent shows. But getting into what we're actually supposed to be talking about today, the conflict continues to take a slow and steady approach to Russia's favor despite what may have been seen on the ground first. And of course, we have plenty of news about NATO, about the economic fallout of this as usual, and a little bit of domestic news focusing on American energy industry we'll get into, of course, because I do like to touch on that as well. And of course, we'll also get into some of the disputes within the US Senate about aid to Ukraine and the US role in the war going forward. But without further ado, it has been a war of, and here's the title drop, bait and switch. So just to pull up the map of Ukraine with what we have here, it's been a slow and steady Russian advance, and I can't recall who wrote that article you had sent me, but it was described now that we have about 2.5 months, almost 3 months of the war under our belts, taking a look at what has actually happened. It's been a series of Russia more or less, faking or baiting advances to somewhere else to draw Ukrainian forces, and then striking where they've left their weak spots, which are usually in eastern Ukraine, which seems to be the area they're trying to secure. As you can see by the map right here, of course, the key is up. Red represents Russia and any Russia-aligned groups, whether that be the Donbass and Luhansk militias, Belarus, Transnistria, etc. Blue represents Ukraine and all of their backers and sponsors and whatever. Of course, the key does have a few other groups that aren't particularly involved right now. Those marks you see on the map in blue with the circle inside it in four lines, those are air raid sirens that have gone off. Of course, the shell icon is for where either bombs or shells are dropped. The Kalashnikov rifle icons, of course, once again, I know it's been a while since we've shown the map, are where there is actually on the ground fighting taking place. But getting further into that, it has been this war of baiting and switching where Russian forces will lure forces, for example, get them to mass around Kiev or Odessa or any of these particularly major urban areas or any area that they don't intend on at least taking now, and you could argue don't want to take it all, and then bringing in those other forces or using the Donbass forces to clean up in the east and advance further. Because as you can see with the map, a just about that, I would say half of what would be considered Novorossiya would be occupied. We saw this earlier with the Kharkov offensive, where it looked like they were going to do it, and then they hit where again the main offensive is, particularly with Luhansk is slated to fall in the next few days here, if not over the course of the next day, as we saw with Mariupol, as we saw with Donetsk, and of course there is still I I don't even know what you call them, the people trapped within the deep recesses in the basements of the Avastal factories, or Avastal factory, I should say, and that has still not been resolved. They have been pulling every humanitarian plea. They've reached out to the U.S. government. They've reached out to European governments. They even got so desperate where they added Elon Musk on the new owner of Elon Musk on Twitter on his, of course, newly acquired platform, begging him for help, saying you must help us, blah blah blah. But point being is, despite every narrative that has been thrown about this war, we still see slowly but surely and consistently Russian advances and Russian gains. As for the casualty numbers, I haven't checked those recently. I haven't checked a lot of on the ground information recently because my focus, once again, and you guys can probably tell me whenever we do the show, is more on the economic side, where our friend here, GSP, of course, we all know him, we all love him, likes to focus much more on the ground action, which is a bit funny because it's a bit of an inverse of what it used to be for our longtime listeners. If you recall our coverage of
Hmm.
Syria, where
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it was completely the opposite there. But I guess we just gotta change things up every once in a while. But the point I am getting at, I haven't checked the casualty numbers on either side lately. But once again, that gets down to the point of how much is each side willing to tolerate. I did see, however, in terms of human numbers, since the beginning of the war, about 6 million people have evacuated from Ukraine, whether that be to Poland, Romania, Slovakia, other places in the West. I don't know if they count the people who in the East who went to Russia, but we also do have some stories about a little bit of ethnic tension taking place in Poland, as we've covered over the past couple weeks
Hmm.
here. But I will turn it over to you now because I'm sure you have plenty to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, why don't we begin where we began last week, and that's with Mariupol. So, uh, one of the things that I found very interesting this week about, well, there were several, but I'll start with this, is the photographs that have emerged out of Mariupol are incredibly good photographs. Now, as some listeners know, I'm a photographer, and uh, at that, I am a documentary and street photographer. So I do have an eye. I can tell when photos are very well done. Now, I can't tell you necessarily whether this was taken with a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, or a good phone, but the lighting is superb. So these images of men who are missing limbs, some of them smiling for the camera. There was another gentleman with like this metal brace attached to his arm. Another one, there was a guy missing an arm. Uh, Generally horrendous shots, but if you look at the color palette, you look at the lighting, it's very, very well done. I mean, if there was an Instagram influencer that wanted like good shots, these would be it. So I found that very curious. Um, Now, as for the guys that are trapped, a few of them try to escape, and they're essentially gunned down. They're not going to give up. And one of the reasons they won't give up is they know that if they do, then they will be either tried by the people of the Donetsk republics, and or they will be eventually tried in Russia beginning in June. So now we are, I would say, about 3, maybe 4 weeks away from those proceedings. And if you're an Azov guy, your chances are very, very slim. Uh, and it's for this reason that they want like a mediating country, or they want a mediator like the Pope. So two of the leaders of Azov, not necessarily the guy who created them, Litsky or something, but I think his name is Poro Poropenko. I'm probably mispronouncing it. Anyways, um, two of them met with the Pope, and there's hilarious photos of one of them, his young wife, who is doing a Roman salute with two other girls, and there's also the other girl, the brunette, whose husband is was one of the guys sort of torturing the POWs. But curiously, in this group meeting the Pope is a guy with a beard. He's got a jacket on. He's got a white, well-pressed shirt. Now, I had no idea who this guy was, but as it turns out, he's a Russian guy, a Marxist, and he was married at one time to one of the girls in Pussy Riot. He's infamous for stripping nude along with the another couple that belonged to Pussy Riot in the uh, Moscow Museum of Natural History, and him having sex with his pregnant wife, who he is divorced from. He's described as a new Marxist. um, so you can tell that this region is rife with all kind of various ideologies, wanting to pull on Russia to go this or that way, working with foreign powers and foreign influence in order to reconstruct Russia in some way. And I mean, literally the most disgusting people are always associated with Ukraine, and particularly the Azov guys. And then this guy, who, like, quite honestly, like, we covered the Belarusian protests and in 2020 in August, and this is liberal um, blogger in Russia who interviewed that guy that was detained, Presakovich. I forget. I'd have to look him up. He was the guy that was flying in Ryanair with his girlfriend from Italy. He met with Pyatt. Pyatt was the guy with Newland at the Maidan in 2014. He's now back in the Biden administration, for anybody who doesn't know. And so this guy got detained. Well, I mean, long story short, he's left his girlfriend of 6 years, and he's married another woman, but they're both detained. His girlfriend is, she's going to get 6 years in prison. And anyhow, so this liberal journalist is interviewing this guy, and it's just nonsense. He's this Belarusian is talking about how he's a journalist, and he only went like, it was just I was just LARPing when I dressed up in Azov fatigues and wore the badges. And he has no articles from around that time. He has no photos from the time that he spent there. And an American journalist that met him for 3 weeks in the trenches prior to 2020 said that he was he was certainly not shooting with a camera. So, anyways, it looks like Lukashenko was right, and he is now in jail. And who knows, he might stay even longer. But to get back to Ukraine, so the the Azov guys stuck in Azovstal are pretty inconsequential. Uh, the allied forces of Russia, so this includes the Russians, the special forces, the Donetsk People's Republics, the Chechens, Ossetin volunteers, um, a whole ragtag group, and they are in. They've basically evacuated Mariupol. So Mariupol, the schools are open. I mean, yes, huge swaths of the city are destroyed, but they did have a successful May 9th victory parade, very different than the May of 2014
Yes, no
when
declarations of war, no nuclear firebombs, no mobilization. So we were right, nothing happened on May 9th.
That's right. That's right. So all that talk, it's just like before Blinken met with his Chinese counterpart, said, China, you better not be supplying bullets to Russia, which is nonsense because Russia has like this city since the late Middle Ages that all it does is produce firearms. All through various incarnations of Russia, that city has been there, and it's still producing enough that not only can it produce enough for like to fight in Ukraine, it still produces enough to supply arms dealers like throughout the world. So, you know, there goes that. But I mean, the objective basically of the West is to claim that Russia cannot fight a long-term war, which is actually the case for Ukraine and not Russia. So it's a kind of a projection. In the same way that early on they claimed that two IL 74s, these warplanes of the Russians, were shot down around Kiev, and then it turned out one of the wreckage was actually a MiG-29 of the Ukrainian Air Force. Like, part of the reason they did that is there was a battle in Ilyavosk, and early on the Russians actually knocked down like at least two planes belonging to the Ukrainians and a helicopter filled with Ukrainian generals. Most people don't know that, but I remember watching that footage. This happened, by the way, throughout July and August. So um, Mariupol, also the parts that are functioning now have electricity. Um, so gradually the city is coming back, and there are only about 2,000 fighters, whereas there were about 35,000 fighters in order to take Mariupol. But the strategy of Mariupol is going to become, I think, the strategy for most of the fighting that's going to happen in Ukraine. And that includes the Donbass. Now, there are some exceptions. But before I get to the exceptions, I'll focus on two areas that have been liberated, one of them very recently. I'll start with uh, the latter first. That is Popasnaya. So Popasnaya is a strategic hold. Now, it's not a very big town, but what makes it unique is like it's the highest area in East Ukraine. So it gives you a visibility of 30 kilometers. And positioning your artillery in that area makes all kinds of things, all sorts of things, much easier. Uh, there's artillery that can reach, you know, in excess of 15 kilometers from that range. Some artillery can go nearly twice that. So this is an important town. And the other place that was captured about 2 weeks ago was Izuyum. This is a bigger settlement, and the pull away from Kharkov. So if people can picture Kharkov, basically what you have is a radius from northwest to north, northeast to east that the Russians were maintaining. Now, the northeast section was not particularly much invested in because it didn't have many forces. The Ukrainians made an attempt to take it. They took some parts, they suffered heavy losses, they pulled back. And then, as May 9th approached, just like Snake Island, which I'll get into, they made another push. And this time, the Russians pulled back. They pulled back from the northwest to north section, and now they're like right on the border and basically staving off future Ukrainian attacks. Now, there are not a lot of Ukrainian forces in this area, and thankfully, there are not almost any civilians either, because that debacle by the Russians in Bucha, where people were friendly to them and then they left, although they did announce that they would leave, but I would hazard to say that this, for one reason or another, was not relayed to the civilians that were kind to them, and this meant their deaths. This the video of civilians getting rounded up and beaten in the street in Irpin, which is another sort of town just outside of Kiev, a little further away than Bucha. So, anyways, what you see now is, if you think of it as a blob, so the blob is getting thinner and smaller from north to northwest around Kharkov, and it's getting thicker and now going to southeast around Kharkov because that's blocking uh, access into the areas that are now stuck of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. And this is also propping up the salient around Izuyum. Izuyum. So that's now, since this takeover has stretched several kilometers further south, there are more and more towns that have been taken. If you give me a second, I'll see if I can get my notes on which towns have been taken.
Make sure you get the
Uh,
good flipping sound of the notes in the audio. We really need that just for the effect.
um, this might take too long, quite honestly. Anyhow, I mean, a lot of these towns, I don't honestly like remember their names. They're and many of them are like instead of Gorovka, it'll be a play on that. How can I put it? Like they sound almost like there's Donetsk and there's Severodonetsk. Um, so it's very easy to confuse them. However, what I would say is there are new salients that are opening up out of Donetsk, and probably the biggest culture now is in this pocket around Lugan, in the Lugansk area. Okay, like Lugansk is about 97% fully liberated, and there have been some withdrawals from some of the towns, but in towns like Izuyum and Papasnaya had very little troops that ever left. And I mean here the Ukrainians before they lost it. Izuyum, like literally everybody, all the Ukrainians that fought there died. There was no retreat from there. But as I said on the last show, there have some brigades have left, right? Um, However, there's also been desperation to send more troops into Donetsk. That is something also that's developing. The Southern Front has not had much happen. There hasn't been any noticeable changes. Um, like I said last week, more parts of Kherson along the beach front have been captured, and I suppose um, because it deals tangentially with propaganda, I'll just briefly bring up Snake Island. And so when Snake Island was happening just before May 9th, obviously, like Kharkov and Snake Island were, as PR moves, really important for Ukraine and really important for Western media. And the thing is about Snake Island is, of course, it began with two Russian vessels. These are small vessels, like little attack vessels, about the size of a fishing boat that were sunk by, presumably by drones. And the Russians had evacuated Snake Island. And the reason I bring this up is eventually the Ukrainians came around and admitted this. Now, the Ukrainians have also admitted heavy losses and that it was Zelensky that pushed for this. The generals did not want this. Snake Island is very much in the south. It's even further south than Odessa, and it's a tiny island.
Yes, and
The
if you're
British,
looking at the map right here, it'll be where that little flame symbol is, right next to the maritime border of Moldova.
yeah. So the British were saying, oh, they're going to put like S-400s there. The problem is it's so tiny. Where are you going to put them? It has no trees. It has no cover. And frankly, it's so close to the Ukrainian shore that some of Ukraine's long artillery can hit it. So it in terms of geography, it's not really as well situated as it could be. I suppose if it was another 15 kilometers more into the Black Sea to the east, then it would be better. But as it stands, it's not easy to defend. Anyhow, so the Ukrainians have admitted to heavy losses. We're looking at three boats that were sunk that were like these again would be small boats for amphibious landing. No less than 10 helicopters, about two or three attack aircraft. So we're talking like maybe Su-25s, Su-24s, or MiG-29s. They were downed. Approximately 50 of the personnel were lost. Of that is the 24 or so special units within that roughly 50, right? Now, Western sources, of course, made no mention of this. There was one article that was buried, but that's about it. There was literally nothing on it. And the interesting thing is the no one in Western media has acknowledged this. But the funny thing is the Russians and the Ukrainians tend to agree. Now, when this story broke out, it was like Ukraine really, destroyed these Russians who were there, and they've taken over like, but they eventually walked all of that back. That isn't to say that there haven't been heavy losses with the Russians, and particularly as those salients are growing and crossing to get into I think Lysychansk has been captured, is about to be captured. This is again in the east, right? And um, there was a pontoon that was destroyed, and one report is saying like un, somewhere under 50 Russian personnel were destroyed, and over a dozen military vehicles were destroyed. Now, I haven't seen any photos. And South Front, which is a source that we depend on, right, for information, for several reasons. One is they tend to be conservative, right? Like if you're really into the numbers of losses, and they have credible information, uh, South Front will always tell you whether it's a Russian or a Syrian or a Kurd or a Turk or an American or an Egyptian in the eastern zone of war. They'll tell you right now if they don't know, if they can't prove it, if their sources on the ground can't confirm the actual number, they won't. But also later on, they'll tell you what the overall losses are probably at, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think you would agree with me why we depend on South Front is because they tend to be more conservative. Now they did have a story on Snake Island, and of course it came days after everybody else. But why? Well, because it takes that long to confirm exactly what happened.
Yes, and you
And
can see
and
this
they
throughout their
are
track
critical of
record
Russian
because
strategy.
South Front really cut their teeth on Syrian war reporting, and they were
Yes.
consistently the best source on everything and anything Syrian uh, ever since they started. Because I think they started a few years after the war got going, and that eventually, of course, expanded into the other Middle Eastern conflicts. And while again their opinion pieces have actually been, as you said, critical of the Russian approach to this war, they do their due diligence, whether it's
Yeah.
on Syria, whether it's on Yemen, whether it's on Ukraine, or whatever they're reporting on.
Right. And I think it's like um with war, I mean, people get really wrapped up in it, and I think maybe doing this show for us has has put extra pressure for, as you say, due diligence, to practice due diligence, because you're just going to end up like you become a Telegram and Twitter digest, right? And you don't want to do that. I mean,
Yes, which
even
is
me
a
going
big reason I actually
laboriously.
focus
Oh,
on opinions on the show, because we can spout facts, numbers, and statistics at you all day, but you come here because you're interested on what people have to say about it. Now, again,
yeah.
I don't expect you to even agree with us most of the time. I expect this to, make you think about it. But point being is, you can, as you were saying, become a talking Twitter feed or a talking Telegram chat, and I don't really think that does a service to anyone. And what we are really trying to do here is we're trying to get into, well, what does this all mean? Where do we think this is going from here?
Right, exactly. Like we've discussed on the show before about how at the beginning of the war there was this like effort within the liberal West to reconcile the differences in their culture wars, right? And you saw that happen. But the primary reason for that is because everybody understands that despite all the hysteria about Nazis in the West, that they're not a threat, um, and that for that matter, Azov is not a threat to the West. But if you take them at their word, their ideological premise for their arguments, then you know yes, they are in contradiction. But the fact is America has sided with every kind of ideology to prop up its liberalism, because liberalism is, it's both decadent and at the same time it's incredibly pragmatic and materialist, right? um, so whatever claims it makes about what it's trying to do as a global project is ridiculous, right? Because of course they're going to side with Azov, because Azov's not a danger to them. Russia is, right? And liberals understand this fundamentally, and in
Yes, and
many cases intuitively.
it's even differentiated, but not too much. But I will say there is a differentiation from what the Cold War conservative, or dare I even say neoconservative, would have believed, where many of them, especially you could say like the conservatives during the Cold War, were open that we're here to defend American interest, we're here to do X, Y, and Z, where it was a very straightforward prospect that we're willing to work with South American dictators or more radical groups in the Middle East or whatever because it's against the Soviet Union. But it seems
Hmm.
to be a bastard fuse of the idealism of the liberal side of the American empire fused with the ruthlessness and at least perceived pragmatism of the conservative side of the American empire, where out of their mouth they'll be telling you about human rights, democracy, or whatever they need to justify it. But behind the scenes, it's still that same ruthless, pragmatic policy that is arguably diluted by their own ideology. Whereas before, you could just ignore the contradictions by saying, quite simply, it's in our interest. But now it has, and I mean, they'll still go back to that, but they'll give you a long-winded ideological explanation before going into any of this, and it really shows in this narrative I think we've been hitting on for the past few episodes here that they have to find a way. They've become so ideological. They have to find a way to reconcile it within their own ideology. Because before the American Empire, you could say its most nascent state was something that actually favored the American people, was something that actually favored American wealth and power on a grand scale to the point where seemingly everyone would benefit from it. But you could say the American Empire in its fullest form, say post World War II, really came to be about, of course, domination and control, as all empires are, but particularly the bottom line, particularly profit, particularly the economy. I mean, for example, the phrase "banana republic" or that "Kun Guatemala" in order to secure I believe that's where the term "banana republic" originated, to secure again the banana trade, or intervening in Cuba to preserve our business interests there. To the point where I'm not saying those things don't happen anymore, but it has become far more ideological, far more revolutionary, so to speak, in terms of dethroning any rival ideologies,
You're
not
right,
because they
right,
threaten our bottom line, but fundamentally because they disagree with us and have a different way of life.
right. And I personally don't know if they really believe that they. I mean, I know there are people within the system that believe they will accomplish it, even if it takes 100 years. I do believe that. I don't necessarily believe that people above them believe that, right? Like this is an ideology, so it has a quasi-religious qu- narrative quality to it. It's a motivator. You saw in the way the war in Syria repackaged Al Qaeda and ISIS to the point where like people are like, yeah, okay, but Al Qaeda, the same people who believed Al Qaeda attacked them on 9/11 are the same people say, well, they're bad, but they're not Assad. And that kind of repackaging of Azov has also happened, right? So like
Well, I'm
they
really
will
glad you brought up the
contradict
Syria
themselves.
example because the repackaging always comes with the contradiction because they will do that, but then they will say Al Qaeda is funded by Iran and that means the Iranians had a hand in 9/11. And again, it becomes
Yes,
this thing where, well, maybe Al Qaeda is not that bad because they're fighting against Assad and Iran, but then the next
yes.
day, of course, it is they are an Iranian proxy group despite the fact that they are at war with Iranian proxy groups in Syria. And it leads to this, again, absurd convolution as all these narratives will eventually delve into because they're fundamentally not even based on a kernel of the truth. Whereas something that is at least based on the kernel of the truth may have its pitfalls, may have its contradictions, but when you chip away at all of those, there's still some baseline of coherence. But when you have something that's complete falsehood, complete lies, when you chip away at it at the end, of course, there's nothing.
Right, right. And just two more things I'll say about Azov that I found really quite interesting is they had a video they released today, and it's of this guy, this big burly guy with a beard, and he's got a Ukrainian flag. And you notice his right wrist, he's got a big Star of David tattoo. Uh, I used to think maybe, the photo of the guy at the Wailing Wall with a tattoo on on the base of his neck was like, and he's wearing a hupka, like was some kind of a meme. like it was and it could very well be doctored for all I know. But I saw this and I was just like, what is going on? I thought, because you hear reports, like for instance, there's a guy named Adrian Bouquet who was a French Special Forces soldier. Now he went to Ukraine for 3 weeks on a humanitarian mission, and he says he witnessed war crimes. He saw Ukrainian forces using human shields, as of kneecapping Russian POWs, killing them. He says, while I was there, I I saw all of this committed. As he put it, all were committed by Ukrainian army. Um, that's interesting. And then to return to my earlier point about the Azov guy with a Star of David, I saw a post on Twitter, I sent it to you, of Canadians, four ragtag Canadians who had gone to fight. And I believe one of them, somebody in the replies asked them about, like, how can we join? And friends, why did you not say you were one of ours? This is from, like, I don't know who this account is. And he says all the guys are Israelis in exile, one from here, one from there. So I guess, like, I mean, 21st century Nazism is basically, it's not full 20th century Nazism. It's just a Nazism that's against Russians. That's it.
Yeah, well, it's the Gladio version. That's quite literally all
Yeah,
it is.
you're right. You're right. It's post World War II Nazism. It's just the Gladio version. So I just thought, I thought that was interesting. But um, yeah, I mean, just to wrap things up with with Ukraine, I would say that you know, according to the Russians, very heavy losses. Even some of the captured officers and soldiers are also claiming very heavy losses on the part of the Ukrainians. I mentioned that boat crossing, that was probably the biggest loss the Russians have had in a long time. Um, you know, somewhere between 40 to 45 guys, 48 guys is a lot. I mean, again, I don't know. Nobody posted any photos. I'm going by what some Telegram accounts have said, but if they're true, then this is a heavy loss. That said, they still made it across the river, and now they're forming a salient enclosing another cauldron. What the Ukrainians are going to do, I don't know. Some of the howitzers have reached these areas. There was another plane at the beginning of the week that was knocked down. Um, Odessa suffered several attacks, including a place that was holding foreign mercenaries. It's believed about 35 of them were killed. There was also an ammunition depot. There was a video where, like, this missile hits it, and then there's an explosion, and then another and another, and every subsequent explosion is like bigger than the last one. That tells you it was an ammunition depot. So material losses for the Ukrainians is very high, but in their media they'll tell you Russians are running out of military material. Right now, Russia has committed less than 10% of its entire military into this conflict. It is still not introduced, and as you said at the earlier on, there was no, Putin has not called for a mass mobilization, and I think what we're seeing with this bait and switch attitude that the Russians are adopting isn't just about um, more effectively destroying Ukrainian forces in the Donbass with minimal losses. I think what it's also doing is indicating, I think this is just me, but areas that they don't plan on permanently taking. Now, um, to one last thing I'll say. Um, Obviously, the Russians are now going to take the whole southern part of Ukraine, because the longer this war goes on, and we've been saying this from the very beginning, that the longer that there is no diplomatic agreement, the more territory Ukraine will lose. And so that entire southern part, the Novorossiya part, stretching from Mariupol to Kherson, that's 3.1 million people. and it now means the Azov Sea is completely under Russian control, and they've gained another like 150 kilometers by taking Kherson. So this is far more territory. This now foreign ships can no longer go into the Sea of Azov,
And it's
and
also worth
even
noting
around.
that just beyond territorial concessions and demands therein, that peace demands otherwise will also become less conciliatory. As Russia has stated today, they will not accept a peace agreement that would see Ukraine in the European
That's right.
Union. Now,
Yes.
even going all the way back to 2013, they were, before now, they would tolerate Ukrainian EU membership so long
Yes.
as it was not coupled with NATO membership and also included the continued economic cooperation with Russia. But now, as we've gone on for about 2.5 months, even that has been taken off the table for the time being. And I doubt it's going to be put back on the table. Maybe we could see some diplomatic maneuvers where Russia does concede on that point in particular. Maybe this is just a hardball strategy. I doubt it, but for the time being, it looks like the bare minimum that they will accept in peace agreement. Not discussing the territorial concessions, but the state of Ukraine in the future is that Ukraine must be a neutral player on the world stage.
Right. Uh, even as late March, because the meetings in Ankara were taking place between the 13th, 14th of March. They went on for a few days, as I recall. Then there was that whole panic, based on what Peskov said, which you know, treatment of Russian POWs had surfaced, and people were like, "We are not settling." The average Joe, the average Russian was like, "We are not settling for." Sorry, there's an idiot in my neighborhood. All right, go. um,
You're
so
being gang
you know there
stalked.
was
I'm sorry to say. It's
you
been
know there
nice
was
knowing
there
you.
was too much blood and treasure to settle only for Lugansk and Donetsk, and reiterate that Crimea is Russian territory. So yes, the longer this goes on, the more the land Russia is going to take. Maybe it was calculated in the beginning that the Ukrainians were not going to be serious. Certainly the Russians early on had to use a strategy where they could not cause panic in their partners. If Russia had blown Kiev to smithereens, it not only would have created more enemies, even in areas that were uh, generally favorable to them, um, but God, this idiot. Um, but even so, not even in areas where there's always been Russian hostility, but in areas where people were, let's say, more undecided, or you take a region like Kherson. Kherson was not like it's pro-Russian, but not very pro-Russian, not in the way that Donetsk and Lugansk are, much less so. And you can, if you see voting maps from 2010, you can see that it was maybe 60-40, not 90 versus 10. So way different. Now, if they had done this kind of approach, it would have been nearly impossible for countries like Saudi Arabia, India, Qatar, all these very important countries, because mind you, you know, uh, them working with the Russians basically, and we'll get into this in the economic side of things, has helped rescue the ruble, which is doing fantastically well. Um, so that couldn't have been done, and I think the Russians basically, one hope was that Zelensky would concede very quickly, and there would not be a necessity, like Ukraine would have to reform Ukraine, right? Russia wouldn't do it. And that would legitimize Ukraine and Russia, right? When that wasn't the case, Russia has to do it, which to some extent in the West delegitimizes anything that happens thereafter. in a bigger way than, say, if Zelensky had done it, right? They would have talked about pressure and so on and so on, but in the end, it's not comparable to, let's say, what Russia is doing now, right? So I think that was the case then, but you know, all plans have contingencies, and it didn't work out, and so now, that huge swath of land that connects Crimea and to the Donbass, they will, in my estimation, they will never let go of that. It will just never happen. If they did, those people, Ukrainians would literally slaughter those people for going along. They would do something far worse than Bucha.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you have covered uh, everything that can really be said insofar as that's concerned. And you did mention something about the economic side, which, with that being said, with the ruble, where the nuclear option economically was pulled by Russia, with where they again demanded that these commodities, mainly oil and gas, be paid for in rubles, and now it's gotten to the point where Russia is starting to pay off their own debt as a nation in the ruble, where it is higher than what it was before the invasion, and it's not quite, but it is slowly but surely on an upward trajectory, and arguably, if this continues, it will be back to where it was before this entire crisis even started. Now, with that all being said, you have also had Ukraine, naturally without authorization, turn off gas transit through the country, which deprives Europe about 1/3 of what it was getting from that gas. Whereas Ukraine started to shut off gas flowing through the country, and that cut off about 1/3 of what flows through Ukraine. Is what I was getting at there. So energy prices in Europe will continue to rise because of that, and also within the states. And I do have some news about the American energy industry I will get into in a little bit here, but ultimately, and it's been said many times before on the show, but I do think it is worth repeating. What we have seen with this is the sanctions reach their, let's just say, their maximum effectiveness that they could have reached, and it
Mm-hmm.
has been once again diminishing returns from here on out to the point where several countries, and you can look at the map, pretty much every country that isn't part of the EU or some American satellite in the sense of, say, Australia or New Zealand, or, again, countries that aren't under a real direct American control, because, of course, as it stands, you could argue we're getting into the era of multipolarity, which I would argue that, but in terms of America's up until recent hegemony, the core areas of the empire it occupied, such as the American mainland, Canada, most of Europe, Australia, Japan, etc., all those countries that obediently went along with the sanctions, and even Europe is a bit arguable with that. You look at those maps, and outside of those countries, very few of them have participated in the ongoing sanctions regime. Probably the main players there would be India and China in terms of keeping Russia's economy afloat, where India and China have not cut off Russia economically. People are less surprised by China, even though China has faced threats of its own sanctions. But India was one of those countries that's on the fence. India has, as the rising world power, as we were told for many years, India's superpower 2020. We're still waiting on that in about 2 years, almost 2.5 years, past due. But with that being said, India was a country people weren't sure about. It was waffling. People thought it may go along with sanctions. If India would have gone along with sanctions, I'm not saying it would have diminished the Russian efforts, both militarily and economically, but it would be a much less favorable situation than what we're looking at today if
Yeah, I
India.
mean, I think that would have forced the strategy to change.
Oh,
I think,
absolutely.
like, now they're like, they know the economic front is secure, so they can go super slow, with minimal losses, minimal upsetting, Russian moms, Uh, and that strategically is very good. As I've always said, I think in the first 4 weeks, I think there was tremendous uncertainty. We didn't even know if like NATO would go in. Uh, some countries broke, some stayed firm behind Russia. But like now that's secure, and you're seeing Russia adopt a different strategy because they're not being pressed for time.
And with all that being said, the ruble, of course, is not the most valuable world currency, but it is currently the best performing in terms of increasing in value by whatever increment it's being measured in, of course, whatever period of time we pick. And that also shows, let's see, the date on this in particular, the date on these charts. Uh, this shows from this year, the beginning of this year, from January 2022 to May 11th, which is yesterday is the time we're recording. We're recording the day of May 12th. You will be listening to this on May 13th if you're listening to the premiere. NASDAQ is down consistently, and just to read the exact snippet from it's from the Telegram group Eurasia and Multipolarity, which they're one of the better ones. I will admit. I think there are better out there, but they're pretty good at curating information. So, and I quote: "After the ruble has become the best performing currency worldwide, now also the Russian stock exchange is strengthening. Negative 30 on par with Nasdaq since the start of the year, but the latter keeps recovering while the Na- the Nasdaq keeps losing while the Russian stock exchange keeps covering, which is also RTS, where you can see, and I don't have the graphs on hand, where it dipped down from, let's see, about 1200 to 700 at the start of the war in late May, and now it is currently back up to about 1,000. So it's recovering, whereas Nasdaq, as the beginning of the year, was at about 16,500 and currently sits at about 12,500. So, of course, NASDAQ is still higher naturally with the American economic engine, crippled as it may be, still being the strongest in the world. But in terms of trajectory, the Russian stock exchange, the RTS, is on a consistent incline since the start of the war, believe it or not. After the pulling of the sanctions, after all the punches were pulled, after the nuclear option was taken on both sides, it turns out, while it may be a painful process, Russia had much less to lose than what the West did, and Russia had much more room to recover than what the West did. And you're starting to see the merits since 2014 of the initial sanctions regimes that came in after the annexation of Crimea, where many people criticized Russia for more or less hoarding its treasure and not investing it back in the country. That was a big criticism, both inside and outside of Russia. But it does seem like something of this rainy day fund has, number one, paid off, and number two, in a way, has almost made them more sovereign because their economy is no longer so interconnected to the global economy. Now, of course, if China cut them off, and China is also very interconnected to the global economy, then it would be a dire situation. The worst forecast about Russia, I do believe, would come true if China cut them off, although, once again, the possibility of something like that happening is very unlikely, as we've discussed the dynamic between Russia and China before. The fact that, I mean, China would suffer a lot, too, as a result of that, in terms of especially energy. A lot of that energy that was sanctioned by Europe has gone to China instead and has gone to India instead and has gone to several other countries instead of European nations and even America at this point, even though those sanctions are skirted on the daily, as we do see at this point, American import of Russian oil has still not stopped despite the sanctions, despite being tough on Putler, and despite the rising gas price. Gas prices spiked yet again after they stabilized there for a while. They were in about the high threes as the national average. Now they're pushing the mid fours. They're not quite at the mid fours yet, but national average that is. And with all that being said, at the end of the day, Russia called the West bluff because that's ultimately what it was. and they have gone on further. And the West is not willing to commit anything more economically, if they even can, or military, once again, if they even can. And it has put us in, at least on the global stage, a bit of a stalemate situation where I don't know if I mean, I suppose you could describe it as a Cold War, but I think the terminology would be a bit misleading there. But to this multipolar world, I think is the best way we can put it, where it seems that no side is at great opportunity of supplanting the other anytime soon, and that the world has become rather divided in that sense. And I imagine that will only continue. The credibility of the American empire will be first and foremost as we see going forward, which is why you do see some narrative changes, which is why you do see the lockdowns lifting, because the American empire and her satellites do have to buy some legitimacy in order to continue. Now, of course, they'll hit you with just about everything else they were doing before and gradually ramp that up because they do still have an ideological regime to maintain. But a few places here and there they will ease up, also while crippling you economically, which, once again, at the end of the show, I will get into what Biden did with some of the federal drilling policies and how it almost seems like the policy of what an occupying nation would do to the people it's occupying if they wanted it, rather than an empire actually running itself. And we'll delve a little bit into that later, but that's just a general rundown on the, at least my assessment and our assessment on the economic situation. If you have anything
Yeah.
to add, of course, now would be the time.
Yeah, two or three quick points. One is the Swiss have unfrozen 3.4 billion in Russian liquid assets. This is after the state failed to provide any legal basis to the court. That's a that's kind of big. I'm not saying it's the stage door that that opens and everything else falls down it. So I don't know if that's some, I can prognosticate what else Switzerland is going to do, but that is an unexpected move. The other is there was a very interesting conversation on Odyssey with Dr. Raphael Matthew Johnson, and he talked about the latest thing that Russia is now doing, which is a kind of a mirroring of what Russia instigated with gas for rubles. So the gas for rubles, by the way, 10 more countries have signed on to it. Um, this comes from the Hungarian prime minister, not the president. He's the one who initially said, Europe isn't telling you, but there are 10 European countries who have already signed on. So he was proven right the week later. So this is pretty credible. Anyways, to get to this mirroring effect. So what Russia is doing within Russia is it's forcing investors that have accounts in foreign countries to pay taxes in Russia, to invest in Russia. But at the same time, any kind of investment that they like going out of the country, link um I will link this after the show airs tomorrow, because it's a very interesting discussion, and it's been a few days since I heard it. So, and there's so much going on, I can't remember exactly, but in the same way that, for instance, money of whatever currency is deposited into a Gazprom account and then it's converted into rubles. Similarly, Russian investors in Russia are going to pay in rubles, and that will be converted into different denominations going out. So this is what I mean about a mirroring effect, right? This props up the ruble, and it's also forcing them to do basically what the states does, is now you pay taxes for your profits in Russia. And that is, I bring it up because you just reminded me when you talked about forcing Russians to invest back in Russia, and it's something that wasn't happening in 2014. So, I mean, the oligarchs in Russia, what is ever left of them, and we should mention that guy Chabayas. He landed in Israel on the weekend. He quit himself, so whatever, he's gone. Another traitor that's not needed. But one little story I want to say that I've been noticing is The Economist, other Western publications keep going on about why China is going to fail with its lockdown policy in Shanghai, right? And I've always speculated that I think China is literally doing this like to F around with global supply chain. I think that's why it's doing it. And like I'm seeing stories where they're saying China can't do this forever. So there goes the whole, even the WHO disagrees. The WEF also disagrees, right? So China is now, it joined those institutions. It worked very hard to gain favor, but when the time came to cut in a different direction, it knows now it has to take it. This is the gamble. This is when that is going to happen. And you can tell it's making them angry. They don't want China to be in lockdown anymore. It's hurting them. So that's what I deduce from these articles. Of course, they're not going to like come right out and say it. China's doing this to hurt to hurt Western economies in a difficult time. But I've got my conspiracy hat on, and I tend to think that is actually what China is doing.
I mean, it logically follows, and that seems like something that they would accuse China of. But again, at this time, it would make the most sense for them because it is something that they can do at this point that is, I'm not saying is going to be of no cost to them, but that's of something that is very little cost to them compared to what they can do to the West. That it is a great investment from the Chinese perspective to proceed
Hmm.
forward with this right now. Now, I did want to swing back around to NATO because we do have some news regarding NATO that Finland has has begun the ascension process and will be in NATO within the next few days here, while Sweden is still quote mulling over the process. Now,
Hmm.
this comes as no surprise. This has been something that's been speculated for years, but was really tripped off by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I also think that the ascension of Finland and possibly Sweden into NATO has done some to skew the analysis of what Russia is doing there and Russia's stated goals. Now, many people will point at this where Russia's war would be counterproductive because they actually led to yet another NATO expansion, while that is what they're trying to prevent. But from the Russian perspective, all countries that join NATO are not equal. When it comes to this, they care much less about a country like Finland or Sweden being in NATO than they do, of course, Ukraine. Ukraine is part of that Russian founding mythos, of course. You go back to early Russian history, it is in what is modern day Ukraine, and they consider Kiev the mother of Russian cities, and there are many, as we discussed, many symbolic and metaphysical significant parts of Ukraine to Russia, and that's not even getting into the practical parts such as geographical proximity, resources within the country, etc. But in terms of what it represents symbolically and even metaphysically to Russia, Ukraine is an absolute red line when it comes to membership in NATO. And to a lesser
Hmm.
extent, so would Belarus, but Ukraine in particular. Where I'll say once again, countries like Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, these countries that are close to Russia are, and even the Baltic states such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it's not favorable for Russia that they be part of NATO or be part of the broader Western alliance, as it were, but it is tolerable. It's something that isn't going to be their undoing. Where Ukraine, from even once again a symbolic and metaphysical perspective, being part of NATO is an undoing of Russia. It is a supplanting of Russia's national mythology that their homeland, that their point of origin, as it were, is in the hands of people who are ostensibly the enemy. And for those of you who know just a touch of, say, 16th and more particularly 17th century history, with the wars that went on with the, of course, Cossack rebellions against the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian support for that, and just that lead up to the eventual partition of Poland, it was a it was the utmost goal for Russia to reintegrate Kiev back into its fold. At that time, it would have been Muscovy, it would have been the Tsardom of Russia. It changed. That was around the period when one became the other. But point being is, for that Russian polity, their utmost goal was the reintegration of the Ukraine. So you can see with Russian history throughout the 17th and 18th centuries with the various wars they fought, and one could say culminating in the beginning of the Russian Empire with, of course, Peter the Great, that a large part of that was reintegrating these lands that were historically seen as part of the Rus, that being what is mostly modern day Belarus and Ukraine. So that has much more significance than a land of people who speak a foreign tongue, look somewhat different from them. Again, being a Southern European, or at least somebody of Southern European extraction, those Northern European phenotypes start to all blend into me. And I don't know, maybe you agree. You're technically more Mediterranean than me, but we won't get into that for the time being. Uh, but with that being said, it, it is a fundamental understanding that Finns and Swedes are, and even again Balts and Poles and Hungarians are foreign people to Russia, whereas Ukrainians at the most distance are cousins of Russia.
Right. And I think, at the beginning of this war, we always said how important it was to reintegrate Kiev. As the war has gone on, I would say that is now a very long-term project. I think when you're listening to, for instance, Poland agreeing with Zelensky last week, it was kind of more of a rumor. Did he really mean, no border means no border? Uh, but now it seems like, now it may not happen, of course, but Poland doesn't seem to be kidding about going into Western Poland. And there's videos of Putin suggesting this, even back in 2014, and then this year, before 2-3 days before February 24th, when the war started, about Poland getting back its land. Now he's stipulated that no one can go in. They will be looked at as a hostile power intervening in a war that's not their business. That doesn't mean necessarily that when things die down and there's work and an agreement, that that won't happen, right? And this is what I meant last week when I said it could be such that Western Ukraine becomes integrated with Poland. How this is going to happen, like, I just see this, like, if I was a NATO strategist, I would think, if I was even Polish, I would look at this as a disaster. But then what do you do? Like, Poland is not happy about Pravi Sector or Azov, right? Especially Pravi Sector. Like, how are you going to integrate these people into a single unified country? Where Western Ukraine becomes a protectorate of Poland, right? Now, it's even in their negotiations, they're not saying that Kiev is going to be a part of this. Not from what I've seen so far. People might have other information that hasn't come across for me. Um, so the long-term goal, I would say, is, you know in a kind of a rump state Ukraine scenario. Um, Basically, this has happened historically several times. This land between Russia and Poland becomes kind of like a rump state, and it desperately need it on its own. It cannot really survive as a nation, economically especially, and it
Yes,
has to
and
find
it's
integration. And it's at this point, I think, that Russia is waiting for a peaceful integration. If it had bombed, like, of course, people died in Kiev, and you know innocent people have died there. But if Russia had done to Kiev like what America had done to Fallujah and Mosul and, let's say, Baghdad, it would be over. I mean, Ukrainians would not forget that for a millennia, right? That's impossible, right?
And once again, it
Uh,
goes back to that concept of how closely are these people related, because Americans doing that to Middle Easterners, to people who are
yeah, yeah.
ostensibly foreign and at that rate even a different race, in countries that they have no intention of uh, occupying, well, maybe I shouldn't say occupying long term, but integrating long term, that can be done. You can be very heavy handed when going into a foreign country and waging war as such. And you could see this with wars Russia's even fought with other European peoples throughout the centuries, whether that be, say, most recently Germany, where, of course, both world wars were very bloody in that sense, or getting into, I mean, even all the way back to Napoleonic Wars, the wars against the French, or the Northern Wars in the 18th century. You get the point here. But that's not something you can do when you're trying to, if not even annex, but integrate this country or these people into your sphere. That's not the kind of resentment that you can create, and especially not in the modern world with the way information travels now, where maybe 100, 200 years ago, you could be particularly brutal in putting down a smaller state on your border or even a rebellion within your borders. You can look at some of the Russian crackdowns on Poland throughout the history of the Russian Empire. Those were, you could arguably say, much more heavy handed than whatever Russia's doing to Ukraine right now, where you could get away with that just because of the understanding of how empires were supposed to function back then, number one, and the rate at which information traveled, number two, where certain things were more acceptable back then. And maybe as the world changes, maybe those heavy handed methods will become more acceptable in the future. I really can't say either way. And again, I won't attest to some moral outrage on either side, seeing as, once again, we're talking about events that were centuries ago. But point being is, you can't have that kind of heavy treatment. I would say with pretty much any country within your proximity, and it has to be a country that is ostensibly foreign for you to do something like that and not get, like, not have the entire world come down upon you for it. But with that being said, you were getting in some things about the land in between, of course, Poland and Russia. That swath of land, that flat swath of land, has always been subject to another power, whether that be the Poles, whether that be the Russians, whether that be whoever else, whoever else.
mm.
And
Yeah,
with,
I mean, there's all kinds of, it's fraught with problems, and for everybody there.
yes, and with all that being said, as I was getting at last episode, I'm not going to say definitively, but it wouldn't surprise me if the direction that American empire policymakers, or say even the vassals of the American Empire in Western Europe, try to take this is try to turn this into a land wrought with conflict, similar to what we have in the Middle East, where
Yes,
even if it's not constant outright war, there's always potential for conflict, and there's always some militant group that controls this area, and there's never really any unity under any one polity, where there's always this certain level of fracturing and disunity within that swath of land. And I do think that maybe not now, but later down the road, as they see it'll be more or less impossible to dislodge Russia from the area, they want to turn it into that bit of a lawless land, similar to what they've done to, say, a place like Syria or
I
Iraq.
think that's an excellent point. Like America's, I think, role in Iraq, I think, was to destroy it. I think what you're looking at is what its objective was. It was to create a completely dysfunctional, defunct state where America has enough presence to influence a few things here and there.
Can play the various factions against each other depending on what's
Yes,
most convenient that day.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think it wants a similar kind of scenario in Ukraine as well. Yeah, that's a great point you bring up.
Yes, and you will recall that before the war started, many people speculated Russia wanted a federalization of Ukraine, which I do think previously they may have wanted, particularly for that reason, creating a sense of disunity in a land that they want greater influence over. But as the situation becomes more desperate, as asserting direct control becomes less feasible, I do believe that that'll be the strategy for Eastern Europe going forward because they can't solidify any pro-American bloc or pro-Western bloc to be in control there, such as the vaunted intermarium. Whereas the next best alternative is to pit these groups against each other and have them at each other's throats, at Russia's throat, and just create once again a very Middle Eastern dynamic with all of that.
Hmm. And you can see how important it is for the Russians not to have a dysfunctional Ukraine. I mean, they share a territory with these people, right? Amongst so many other things. Um, Having like this this kind of a huge swath of land that's completely unstable, right, long term, where nothing can be invested in, nobody wants to touch. Economically, that's a disaster, right? So, in a sense, because America couldn't get Donbass, the next best option was to keep it uh, so wrecked that there could not be any proper investment into that area, right? Um, of course, it is territory that they wanted because it has huge gas reserves. Not to mention coal, which Donetsk and Lugansk now have started supplying Russia with. So they don't want any kind of peacetime, essentially.
Oh, I would say that's their absolute goal at this point, and because they could not, and you could even argue that in the '90s with some of the separatist movements that they may have at least given passive support to, such as the Chechens, that they wanted that for Russia, that they wanted this fundamental disunity and even conflict when convenient for them. But that's all I had for that in particular, and I do just have a couple pieces of domestic news if you don't have any other thoughts on this in particular.
No, that's it for me.
So, the couple pieces we have, I'll start with number one, is the U.S. aid of $40 billion to Ukraine has been delayed in the U.S. Senate because of none other than Rand Paul. Now, even Rand Paul in this recent conflict has not been the stalwart that you would have expected him and certainly his father to be in terms of being anti intervention. He's been. I wouldn't call him pro intervention, but he hasn't taken as strong as an anti stance as one would have expected from somebody like him. But he was able to hold up the delay just by more or less doing, let's just say, an unofficial audit of the fund, saying, well, what's this money going to be used for? Who exactly are we sending it to? Etc. And just by being one person who just asked the, you know, who, what, why, how, where, and when, he was able to at least temporarily derail yet another aid package to Ukraine. And that sparked a great amount of outrage. It sparked a great amount of controversy, of course. Rand Paul, just within the domestic American political context, in my opinion, as somebody who has a somewhat positive opinion towards him, has a disproportionate amount of people who are just outraged by his existence. I wouldn't say it quite compares to Trump, but if there's any comparison that you could make, it would be Trump. Where this is the guy who was
Yeah.
tackled by his neighbor out of the blue one day. This is the guy who just really, by especially when it comes to foreign affairs and as we've seen more recently, the convid stuff, by being the skeptic in the room, and I wouldn't even call him necessarily anti, a lot of these things, but just by being the skeptic in the room, he has garnered so much hatred, which at this point, even being past my libertarian days, I would still consider him the most valuable senator we have just for that reason, just being the one who is going to ask those questions, is going to be the one who derails procedure because of stuff like that. And yet again, we find ourselves in a situation where I think to nobody's surprise here that nobody really knows what this money is going to be used for. Just being sent to Ukraine is more or less a blank check, whether that be for one of Zelensky's coke-fueled parties or actual military aid or humanitarian relief. It could be used for any of those things under the sun, and probably all three, or whatever else we may not have mentioned here at this time. But
Mm.
I do think. and there's a reason the story wasn't too publicized. It does show a fundamental disconnect where if the story were more publicized, as let's just say passive the American public is about these sort of narratives, at least a significant chunk of them are, I do think that would actually speak to the average everyday person. Well, maybe they do support aiding Ukraine because of whatever reason, but then they figure out, well, we don't really know what is going to be done with these funds. We don't really know how they're going to be distributed or who they're directly going to. Where it may, again, raise those eyebrows in the general public in America. And that is, of course, on top of all the other domestic energy and just mainly economic issues that have to be dealt with, which I'll get into a few of those here. So, one of the main ones I've seen going around, and I kind of have to put on my tinfoil hat about this one, is there is a particularly baby formula shortage when it comes to this, and people are struggling to get their hands, of course, on that. Now, of course, this is on top of at least a few months out from Bill Gates with, I would call, one of his mental masturbation proposals about we can create a formula so artificial that it's indistinguishable from natural breast milk as it were. And again, I people really like to go down the rabbit holes with that, and then you can get into some of the effects of the injection on what that has done to women and mothers in particular, and some of the health issues that arisen from that. If you really want to put on your tinfoil hat. But point being is, I write off most of what Gates and these sort of people discuss as, I will use the phrase once again, mental masturbation, where they do think they are these ingenious innovators who are going to solve all the world's problems through some vague notion of science and technology. But that's not what I'm getting at. So you have on top of that the baby formula shortage. You have the increased rate of fires at these food processing plants, which, while there has been less than in previous years, because if you go through and put the numbers together, so far we're less, but again, we're not even halfway through 2022. It's May of 2022, so if they continue at the rate they are, I think it'll be just shy of double of the factory fires that we've seen. But with that being said, with all that panning out, you now have the Biden administration suspending drilling leases on oil pockets both in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, which are, particularly the Gulf of Mexico, I would say, is where we get most of our domestic energy from. But Alaska is another big one as well when it comes to that, where energy production will, if it doesn't cease in all areas, will drastically decrease as a result of this. And with that being said, you can only expect, and as we've seen, gas prices to inflate even further along with the price for everything. To the point where, as I was saying earlier, this seems more like the economic projections, the economic uh, activities of an occupying power trying to bring a foreign nation that is waging war on to heel. Now, once again, you can argue that's exactly what the current American elites are to the American people, which I would personally make that argument. But even from a self interest standpoint, you would assume there would be a desire to maintain some level of stability, just to have that core of the empire at least docile enough. Even though people seem to be docile as it is, but they keep on increasing the pressure. And you could consider this just came to me now, that maybe this is seeing how much the people will take before any real pushback starts, because of course people have complained about inflation, people have gone on about this. Republicans are up in the polls in the midterms now. Not that I'm saying that would make that much of a difference, but point being is, I I do think it, maybe in a way they are testing the reactions of the people with the lengths they're willing to go under current conditions, and they will continue to push that envelope further until they do see a serious reaction. Now, of course, I'm not advocating anything, but maybe it would be upon a serious reaction that they would have to reevaluate uh, what they're doing currently or what they have done. But again, this seems, even by the standards of the American elite, overtly hostile compared to what we've seen even in previous years with a hostile American elite.
I mean, one of the things that the last few years, but let's say this year in particular, is just a sense of if they weren't so stupid, I would guess that they want, X to happen. You take Europe, for instance, right? Like, uh, obviously, Europe is in big trouble right now with inflation. I mean, I would believe Putin when he says that Europe is now suffering worse than Russia, right? But I mean, ultimately, it was a stupid thing to do, what they did with the sanctions, with not coming up with a peaceful agreement with Ukraine. But you would think that it was so stupid, it had to be intentional because it can't possibly be that stupid. And I mean, that's the scenario that you were describing taking place in America. There are so many suspicious things going on. I would think, like, can they be this stupid and incompetent that this is happening? Can it not be intentional? But then to what end, right? Like, you're opposed to this country. You need to destroy this country. You need to subjugate it in order to get the very important raw mineral and hydrocarbon resources that you need for your empire to sustain itself. But if you do this, you know, it'll be worse than the scenario that you're already in. And if you do it, you'll actually empower your enemy. And you keep, and I think all of us are baffled because um, it's almost like you want them to win. We could say the same thing about, like, the policy in China, for instance. And just I don't want to go too off topic, but Tony Blair gave two recent interviews. An academic agent did an excellent video on it. And in both interviews, he's emphatic about that the West should not upset China too much. I mean, obviously, it's because economically they're too well integrated that they can't afford to do that. That's my reading of it. Um, and yet there are other policies, let's say with Taiwan, where conceivably things could backfire in a very similar way. One of the things that academic agent always says about um, Tony Blair is he's actually, he's a priest of the elites, and he really is, I think, giving you the most pragmatic and realistic outlook. And we talked off air about another topic that I think will immediately come to mind for you when I mentioned that Tony Blair even thinks the possibility of Trump being elected is okay because there are workarounds
Ah,
that
yes, that. But I do need clarification. So, are we talking about Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, or one of the many Albanian men named Tony Blair? I have to make that joke every time. I hope all of you understand.
Oh man. Oh, that is so cringe. And Bill.
Thank
Just
you,
love.
USA. You are our best friend.
Oh man. Yeah, so I don't know what to say. There's a lot of things that the CIA did that they blamed on incompetence, and I think, like, no, I don't believe you. And this is a scenario that I have to think, can they be so incompetent and not be intentional?
I would say it's probably a healthy mix of incompetent actors and malicious actors. I don't think it's much dichotomy as people make it out to be. I do think Maybe
Mm,
there's the people who are both incompetent and malicious. Then there's people who are malicious, and there's people who are just incompetent. Because I think all of that will work out in that way when it comes to that,
hmm
where you can't really peg it down to one, but I would say it's actually the individuals who are both malicious and incompetent are probably the bulk of the people we're dealing with here. And I would
mm,
say malicious, incompetent, and most importantly, overconfident, where they think they are much
yeah.
more skilled and much more capable than they actually are. And you brought up Tony Blair, that being the British Prime Minister, and Trump having a possibility of re-entering the stage. Now, Elon Musk, the new owner of Twitter, as I mentioned him previously, is expected to let Trump back onto the platform and revoke his pre-suspension that took place after the J6 debacle. Now, this was so much of a non-story to me. I'd forgotten about it on two different occasions, both before the show and before you mentioned it now. But we discussed the possibility of a resurgent Trump, which I do think becomes much more likely if his Twitter is unsuspended because of his means of communication. That Trump, if he is allowed back in, at this point has effectively been groomed into somebody who will be very compliant, and many of the narrative contradictions, at least that he did on purpose, will be will be ended and will not be allowed anymore. Now, I do think because of the kind of person Trump is, just because of the way he runs his mouth, that we will get moments of him at least inadvertently calling out the narrative, as we have many times in the past. But what we would
They'll
have,
even want him to do that for authenticity.
yes, I would agree. But I do think what a lot of people don't understand is even if you liked Trump in his first term, and I liked quite a bit of what Trump had to say and do, even just from a rhetorical perspective, I think what a lot of people have overlooked is that Trump 2.0, Trump that would win in 2024, would be a much more docile and, dare I even say, neutered version of Trump, where it takes all the superficial aspects of what you'd get from Donald Trump, and it would really be an establishment politician wearing Trump trappings, as it were, where they would be completely compliant. Trump would want that, in my opinion, would want that taste of power again, to the point where he would get over to complete compliance. But he would get to wear the Trump trappings. He would get to make the outrageous statements. He would get to do the funny tweets. He would get to do all of that, again, in order to please the crowds and maintain appearances. But fundamentally, as much as I do not like Biden, as much as I do not like the Biden administration, Kamala, any of those people, and while I may even theoretically prefer Trump, I can tell you at least the way I'm looking at it, and feel free to disagree. I'm not gonna force you to go along with it, and you know, uh, you know, correct me if I miss any details here, or do tell if you disagree, because I'm really interested to hear the alternative perspective on this. It would be not a shred of effective difference, even from a rhetorical standpoint, if Trump were to reassume office after Biden or even Kamala, barring any Biden health issues, was in there. Because at that point, Trump has been completely brought to heel. Trump is a good boy now, and Trump will obey the narrative, even if he is allowed to go, even if he is allowed, keyword being, to go off script here and there.
Right. And I read it very much the same way you do. Um, I would say the flip side to that, as far as like people on the dissident right, people paying very, close attention to the possibility of him becoming president again. Ultimately, what their hope is like in Trump being reelected, it's their need to believe that the system is redeemable, that there are enough redeemable and courageous people within the system that it can be redeemed, because his election would spell um, a redemption of the system, which, if it happens, because I think there's also a strong possibility it won't, but if it happens, that is precisely what the elites want. Because as I said at the beginning of the show, they want the cultural war to subside. They have finally they have real external threats, real external challenges to the empire, and in internal division um, cannot over time strengthen the empire against these external forces, right? So even Tony Blair hinted at this, right? So you can see why it's important. If it turns out that Trump is the most viable candidate to win in order to secure this, yes, over and above everything you've said, that will happen. I would say it is to reinstill in the people that the system is redeemable. There would be, of course, screeching from the libs, uh, but that will only help sell the idea of a reemergent Trump who is going to redeem the system. And you hear those ridiculous arguments. Trump, the first term was just learning. His second term, he'll get the right people in his office. Who are the right people exactly? Where are they? What's left of them? I mean, a second term in 2024 has even less of them, I think. Now, I know people will argue uh, what's her name? Marjorie Taylor Greene. Um,
Yes, that's
yes, now it does have a MAGA contingent. I understand. Uh, who knows? You might even get Rand Paul. Uh, I I just think the stakes are so high right now for America that they will not like go into another another round of a MAGA president. I just don't see it happening. I mean, him getting elected, yes, but him, you know, 2016 Trump getting his way, I don't see that.
absolutely not. And I would say that under all the internal political games and the external pressure, that he would be pressured to actually go further on some issues than, say, even a Biden would. For example, if you want to take, if it's even still looming that long, which wouldn't surprise me, if legal issues related to J6 are still going on, it may be encouraged for him to go harsher because he was the perceived cause of the whole debacle at the Capitol, where he has to atone for what he did by making sure these
Mm,
dangerous people get what they deserve. So you could see things like that, and that's just one example of many. And of course, I
yeah,
do think
redemption cuts both ways.
yes, yes, where he would have to fulfill a lot of obligations to the other side as well in order to show that he is a loyal player. And of course, his policy towards Israel will probably be intensified. So pretty much what I could say is, in order to prove himself, the worst elements of Trump would likely be intensified, while the best elements are either played down or completely discarded.
Right, and in reference to Russia and Putin, you will the
Oh, the
libs will
big one!
still hold.
I don't know how I missed that one.
Yeah, like you'll see a lot of narratives on Twitter and Telegram, for instance, and on YouTube for that matter. Um, Trump was tough with Putin. Putin was terrified of Trump, and that's why there wasn't a war. Or Trump would have been a better negotiator. He wouldn't have done what Biden did, right? Another one was, of course, the old one that the libs still hang on to. Trump was Putin's puppet, which is ridiculous because Trump was the first guy to, like, he increased military spending for Ukraine. He was the first to set up lethal weapon deliveries to Ukraine. He was the first to set up sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Like, I mean, Biden is building on everything that Trump did. And that in and of itself tells you that Trump, especially in the last 2 years, was already not the Trump of the 2015, 2016 Trump campaign. And we shouldn't expect like that 2016 Trump to reemerge in 2024, 8 years later, when the situation is much more do or die. his basic responsibility is to bring the conservative element, because the only people who voted against this bill for 40 billion to Ukraine were Republicans, and I think what they were, what, 50 or 70. I mean, they lost big, but that's where the only opposition came from. So what Trump needs to do is, again, like the culture war, is unique, and like the example that we had with like those two women married to Azov guys, and a new Marxist from Russia who like stripped naked and had sex with his ex-wife in a museum. You want that reconciliation in a special circumstance, right? Where these two people on an everyday level probably disagree with almost everything. But because the country is at stake, those differences are put aside. That's what Trump's role will be. Or as I said to my Ukrainian friend many months ago, um, he's an older guy, right? So like there's more boomer aspects, okay, if you were born in the 40s and 50s. So they'll say things like, Republicans love wars, but they forget like Democrats also start them. So he said something like, oh, red state guys, they love to go overseas and kill brown people. And I said, red states supply the men, blue states make the wars. Um, and then he was not taken aback, but that was an eye opener for him. So essentially, Trump's role will be that, right? He needs these two sides to reconcile. Now, the libs are very whipped up about, or they seem to still be whipped up about Ukraine, or on Twitter, when I see screen caps on Telegram from Twitter, you still have blue check marks that keep the Ukrainian flag and so on. And then there's all so that's what he's there to reconcile. And who knows? By 2024, we might have a situation with Taiwan, and I think that would be the more pressing issue
Yeah, and
ultimately.
then also, if you want the trifecta, Iran is still in the cards in terms of being able to be at the center of an
Mm,
international crisis. So if you get
excellent
Russia,
point.
Ukraine, China, Taiwan, and any situation, not just with Iran, but in the Middle East, that's the trifecta right there. That is
Right,
the three primary goals of American foreign policy since the turn of the millennium. And that would be at which point people always like to talk about, when they think the bombs will fly. I think if there would be any point in which the bombs fly, it would have to be that trifecta, which I do think with 2024, that would be a real possibility. And not to mention, I do think with 2024, at least with the way the Russian election system is set up, uh, I believe as it stands now, because the constitutional amendments, Putin will be standing for another term. But if not, there is the ever so slight chance that he may be leaving office. He may be outgoing in 2024. I don't see that happening, but point being is there is the potential for that. And
right.
again, so I think 2024 will be the pivotal year. Now, I know I was talking about 2022 as the most pivotal year of the 21st century so far that will determine the course of the rest of the century. But I think this stretch from 2020 to 2025 will be that, again, between those 5 years, will be like the definitive stretch of the 21st century.
Yes, yes. It will set in motion for everything that comes afterwards. And if there's unfinished business,
And God
as it
willing, we
as,
will be here to cover it.
that's a that's great.
I'm
Yes,
riding this
God
train so the
willing.
wheels fall off, okay? We have sunk too much in this project just to give up now. And you know what? I think we're still going strong, and I, of course, appreciate all of you coming back every week. And, the show becomes more and more interesting as time goes on. I do have to say that we've been doing this for just over 4 years now, and I
Hmm.
mean, just compare this because the first episode you were on was actually the I think about no, like 3 days before the 2018 Syria strikes. Think about that. Think about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I remember.
yeah, and just comparing that situation with everything that has happened subsequently. I mean, I'll admit I was quite literally on edge. I thought Syria was going to balloon up into something really bad back then, but that looks like mere child's play compared to what what we have now. And I'm as relatively calm at least about this as ever when it comes to these sort of things where the issues we talked about in 2018, even the vaunt 2019, which is I think when we really start to see where things were going in 2019, all looks like child's play compared to this. North Korea summit, we're coming up on the 4th year anniversary.
Oh
That
yeah,
feels like a lifetime ago. But point being is,
feels like a nothing burger.
oh yeah, I mean, pretty much everything. I would say 2019 at the earliest. Everything before 2019 in the most recent political paradigm seems completely trivial. It seems like nothing of it matters. 2016 feels like a complete joke. 2017 completely unmemorable. 2018 child's play. 2019 we got to really start to see things. These past 2 years in particular, past 3 years if you want to be generous, have been, you know, I don't want to give ourselves too much credit, but we start to see our predictions, at least in a way, start to pan out. And start to see
Yeah,
some things where I've said this several times on the show. Things I have predicted for the later 2020s that I thought would take place from 2025 to 2030 are starting to unravel now.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's for like in caps relative calm, relative emphasis on relative.
But that's all I had for this episode, unless you have anything we missed last minute.
Um, no, there always is, but I can't remember right now.
It's okay, you can tell me in 10
No, but
minutes,
that's all I
10
have.
minutes post show. Don't worry. And then we'll forget to mention next episode and we'll be lost to time and lost to you people and lost to us. But thank you for everyone for tuning into yet another episode of the War Report, and we will see you all next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.